Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. We are now officially on the Monday schedule for my monologue podcast. Call it the Monday Monologues. And again, midweek, I will hopefully most weeks have some kind of live interview, which I'm not going to do this week because of Thanksgiving in the United States, but I plan to keep doing those on a regular basis. So have a great Thanksgiving holiday, everyone. I'm just going to leave you with a short podcast with a few thoughts and a few topics this week. First, I want to call your attention to my new article in the winter edition of American Affairs magazine. It's basically called Indiana Under Republican Rule, and I will put a link in the show notes. It is a detailed account of what has happened in the state of Indiana during the last 16 years in which it has been run by Republicans. So there's been a Republican governor for 16 years, and the state's been a Republican trifecta state for a decade, since 2011, and the state has basically implemented the full suite of conservative policy solutions. We're talking, low spending, low taxes, billions in reserves, AAA credit rating, light touch regulation, school choice, you name it, pretty much Indiana has done it, and yet the economic results have been pretty terrible. So this is, again, not necessarily the kind of article that I would normally highlight or write in the Masculinist, but it's much more about public policy work, and I'll probably be incorporating a little bit more of that into the podcast and the Masculinist as I go forward, because I'm essentially in the process of, I don't know if retiring that is the right word, but I'm shutting down a lot of it, trying to wind it down so I can be much more focused on what I'm doing with commentary on men's and Christians' issues and cultural analysis. But the economic analysis and the political analysis is a big part of that, because for so long, the evangelical base of the United States has been deeply tied, deeply, intimately connected with the Republican Party and political conservatism. And that's something I think needs to be rethought. Doesn't mean you got to go vote Democrat. I'm not saying hit to vote Democrat, not saying that would even be a good thing. What I am saying is this reflexive rubber stamping of whatever comes down the pike from, Conservatism Inc., reflexively pulling the lever for that GOP candidate has really not served evangelicals well. They have not gotten much of what they wanted. They've essentially been frozen out of the leadership of institutional conservatism, which I've documented. And, I did an entire podcast series earlier called The Republican Party Hates Your Guts, where I went through, the history of conservatism, its, the intellectual history, the social origins, all about grifting, different things like that. So, you might find that of interest. Go look at it. But again, I just want people to start rethinking things. Not necessarily in trying to flip people to the other side. In fact, I'm not trying to flip people to the other side, but want people to refactor their thinking and say, wait a minute, a lot of this conservative dogma was simply not correct, and we need to think about these issues in a more serious and substantive way. And that's what this article is all about, looking at state policy and saying, what does the experience of Indiana tell us about economic policy in the 21st century in America? And so there's a lot of detailed analysis in there. I'm sure there's things you like. I'm sure there's things you don't like. But I hope that you will give it a look. And again, I will put a link in the show notes. Again, it's a serious, substantive discussion of the issues. American Affairs is a really great policy journal, and they're very kind to let me write very long articles for them, longer than anyone else will let me write. So thank you to American Affairs for publishing that. Secondly, I just wanted to comment briefly on this minor kerfuffle that happened in the last week or so around World Magazine. For those of you who don't know, World is an evangelical news magazine published twice a month, I think, and is long-featured journalist by the name, I think it's Marvin Alasky. People love that guy. I don't really know him. I was never really into that guy, never really into that magazine. But, it's a big kerfuffle around it because they started an opinion section. Historically, the magazine had been very focused on news, and they decided that they wanted to start an opinion section. And Al Mohler is the editor-in-chief, and they've got a bunch of people writing for them. And Olasky did not like that. He said, don't think we should be doing that. Don't like these guys. And he was already sort of on the road to retirement. And so he sort of resigned in a huff. And a number of his, people, kind of partisan fans of his at the organization, you might say, his clique, if you will, left as well. And of course, it was oh, this is so horrible that this incredible great man has been forced to step down as they've let these malicious SBC guys take over, et cetera. So I just, if you want to read about that, you can. I just wanted to add one little piece of color on it, which is the fact that this represents needed, the start of some needed generational turnover in organizations out there. Olasky's 71 years old and has been around a long time. This Mindy Bells person who writes for the magazine, who's also one of the people who resigned, kind of one of the original star writers. I think she's the sister-in-law of Joel Bells, who founded it. Well, he didn't found it. We'll get to that in a minute. But she resigned in a huff. And I'm just like, wait a minute. She's been writing for that magazine since 1986. Okay. I'm 52 years old. And in 1986, I was a sophomore in high school. That's how long she's been writing for that magazine. So, Olasky's, they've been around forever. These baby boomers were people who got, again, these top jobs, very high profile, high prestige kind of positions pretty early in life, in the 80s and into the 90s. I think Bill Clinton was like the third youngest president ever when he was elected in 1992, right? They've been holding on tight to the reins ever since. And the truth is, it's time for new blood. It's time for new blood, time for new ideas. And yes, magazines like World need to make some adjustments for the time. And that is not going to happen under the old guard leadership. Now, I put this in my Twitter thread. Some people, accuse me, hey, Al Mohler's a boomer too. He is. There's no doubt about it. Al Mohler is another boomer. I do fight, don't hate him, just like I don't hate Olasky, don't hate, the Bellses or anything like that. It is, but it is fact. There's another boomer, been around a long time, been running Southern Seminary as long as I can remember. And, they put him on there as the editor-in-chief. And I'm like, wow, it's still, even though they're, bringing in a new opinion section, it's still, edited by essentially an old guard boomer. And I think we really just need to have more new generation leadership at the very top of these things. And if you go back to World Magazine was originally called Presbyterian Journal, I believe. And it was the magazine of the conservative faction of the Southern Presbyterian Church. And it had sort of fallen on hard times by the 80s. And Joel Bells, accounts vary. It's been told, one person told me he just sort of did a hostile takeover. I don't know if it was a hostile takeover, but he'd been a writer-editor there. He took it over and rebranded, rebooted it into World. And so at one point, they were, kind of down and, they needed to kind of reinvent themselves to get going again and regenerate it for a new generation. Well, they've done that and now they need to do it again because, from what I hear, subscriptions were down. Some of the people were reading it, not happy with their direction. Times have changed. It's time for new generation leadership to come in and start reinvigorating and reinventing, these organizations. And so I think we really have had a situation where boomer leadership has just been, in place, in charge for way, way, way too long in general in America. And that doesn't mean boomers have to fully retire, go play golf. There are all kinds of roles for sort of elder statesman type people to play, but, they don't need to be kind of the CEO setting like the thing constantly all the time, right? And the previous generations gave them the opportunity to lead, but they have not given that same opportunity to subsequent generations, and it needs to happen. I was having a conversation with someone about this over the weekend, and he's a millennial guy, and I said, look, I think Generation X, we're probably never going to get our turn, if you will, at the top of these organizations. People like me are people who, the role that Generation X is going to play is sort of setting the stage through disrupting some of these power structures, disrupting some of these intellectual ideas. Reagan conservatism really is, in a sense, boomer conservatism, although Reagan himself was not a boomer. This has been the dogmas of that generation. We need to intellectually disrupt sort of boomer dogmas, disrupt their kind of hold on the organizations, give some new building blocks, new perspectives, and it's really going to be probably post-Generation X leadership that then has to really step up and institutionally reinvigorate these things, right? So, again, I think that was actually the original premise of Strauss and Howe's books Generations from 92, is that, in essence, Generation X was going to have to fall on the grenade and take the hit, and then it would be the millennials would lead us. Now, I think they thought the millennials were a new greatest generation, whereas I think in many respects the millennials are quite like the boomers. But nevertheless, hopefully it'll be like millennials or Generation Z who are able to really rebuild some of the institutions on more sure footing for another age. So I don't know that, I'm not arguing here for somebody to call me up and say, Aaron, we want you to be the CEO. I might not be the good CEO, but I think Generation X excels at doing what I'm doing. And if you look at a lot of the people who have mind share kind of in the internet, commentary space, there are a huge number of Gen X people who are really right in there. They're either Gen X or they're very, very young boomers, if you will. That's the kind of transitional generation. But I think there is a generational subtext to this, and that the Olaskis in the boomer generation who were able to seize control of an old institution and remake it the way they wanted are essentially bound to determine that no one else will ever have the same opportunity to put their own stamp on something. And so the guy just seems like he took his ball and went home, which, frankly, he probably needed to do. 71, he didn't need to be around anymore. Doesn't mean we have to say, oh, everything he did was bad. No, I don't know him, but I've never heard anything but good things about him. To be quite honest, very well respected. Again, you don't have to say these guys were bad to say that they've stayed around too long. Many of them did incredible things and just stayed around too long. It's not even, always that they're, completely failing now, but like they just haven't developed the next generation of leadership, and they haven't given the opportunities to the people that they themselves were given. And that's why the baby boomers, again, it's what I call especially the early cohort, which I define that as 42 to like 54 birth years, right? So I actually started a little earlier than the boomers. The people born during World War II, I think, are part of that. And this is the generation that's really been essentially running and controlling in America and has, quite frankly, not stewarded it all that well. So something you can look into if you're interested in reading about a controversy in the evangelical church. And by the way, World is a pretty big magazine. I think they've got something like 100,000 subscribers, so it's not an insignificant institution there. And it does some good reporting. I've definitely read some stuff on their site, even though I'm not a subscriber. As we come into Thanksgiving week, though, I just wanted to plant this idea in your head, which is do not give in to apocalyptic thinking. One of the things I've been trying to stress throughout the podcast is not to essentially jump to the conclusions that, Christianity is doomed, the woke crowd is taking over and everything's going to be awful. And it's sort of a despairing mentality. I think in a lot of ways people have a despairing mentality about the world. The internet people call it blackpilling. It's when you assume that nothing good can happen. Your opponents or the people that you think are evil are going to triumph. And so you end up essentially in a place of nihilistic despair. And, that's really a bad place to be, because when you get into that state of mind, you end up doing often very terrible things that hurt yourself and hurt other people. The incels, for example, are people who've given in to that kind of despair. And when I look at the world, I want to tell you basically two things. Number one, things are bad in a lot of ways. In fact, things may be far worse than you even appreciate. I've been trying to promote this idea of the negative world, that we've now moved to a place where Christianity represents not a moral majority or a silent majority or anything resembling a majority, but is a clear minority of the country and represents a vision or a set of principles that is now actively viewed by the world negatively. They view Christianity as a threat to the new public order, and that we need to adopt a minority mindset in America. And so, I think that's maybe arguing things are worse than a lot of other people might be. I think in a lot of ways, things are far worse than the American middle-class person gives it credit for. And I'm going to keep hitting that. But at the same time, I want people to remain hopeful. I want people to remain optimistic. And I want people to keep their morale up. I don't want people to give into this apocalyptic idea that all of a sudden things are heading to a civil war, or they're heading to, some sort of societal collapse, or, oh my goodness, I did that podcast about kids these days. I got some negative feedback. Well, what you don't understand is, Generation Z, it's different this time. Or the boomers, everything you said about the boomers was right. They sort of did pull out of it. They didn't all just become, druggies who dropped out. Most of them kind of turned around and, became the yuppies. But nevertheless, their values, that sort of sexual revolution, many other things have continued forward to negatively affect our society. I agree. I think, the things that are happening with Gen Z now, these things are in many ways going to be, a further ratcheting of that. Nevertheless, what is it Adam Smith said? There's a lot of ruin in a nation. Okay, so we don't want to give in to apocalyptic thinking, black pill thinking, despair thinking, just this incredibly negative nihilistic outlook on life. The fact is, I think there's tremendous opportunity for America, I just say America, it could apply to other West, to be regenerated in a positive way over time. Now, does that mean it's going to go back to the way it was? No. You know what? I don't want to go back to the way it was. I want to, as they say, build back better. And this is where I think the Christian approach is really needed, because a lot of these kind of online right-wing guys who come from sort of an atheist or kind of neo-pagan perspective, when you start looking at the world and diagnosing the world, they end up with some type of solution like fascism or something like that, because that's just sort of where it leads them. Whereas the reality is, we miss the important point is, actually God is real. And essentially what we need is some sort of re-evangelization of the culture, some sort of new great awakening, spiritual awakening, which again, I can't control when that happens. That is, in many respects, the grace of God, the movement of the Holy Spirit in times and places. But nevertheless, it's definitely possible and has definitely occurred at different points in history, different places. It's not necessarily that, there's this, arc of history that's going just one direction according to, sort of secular progressive thought. It actually doesn't work that way. History pivots, it does all sorts of things, and it's very easy to look around and look at all the things that we see in the world, all the things that we hear in the world, and apply all of our rational thought to that and say there's no way out. It's hopeless. There's no way for our, our values to emerge triumphant. We're defeated, or this, that, or the other thing. And that may even be true. The problem is, the world is so much bigger than what we know. There are things out there, there are answers to questions that we don't even know we are supposed to be asking. Things can happen. Things are happening right now of tremendous epochal importance that we are completely unaware of. Oh, Aaron, what are they? I don't know. That's the whole point. How many people, again, for example, were aware that COVID was going to hit in 2020? I sure didn't. Think about how that's, upended our world. Think about how Donald Trump upended our world. There are all kinds of things going on. And again, I keep going back to, the Old Testament story of Jonathan. And, Israel's been invaded by the Philistines and they're all in hiding. And he basically says, I'm not sure what we're supposed to be doing, but I'm pretty sure we're not supposed to be hiding here in this cave. God is not constrained to save by many or by few. And so he goes out with himself and his armor bearer and he attacks the Philistines. And when you know it, they're defeated. So just two guys basically defeated the entire army. And we should think that way. We should think just because this overwhelming. We saw it again, under I think it was King Hezekiah. This enormous Assyrian army comes under Sennacherib. They sent this demand letter to him, and he basically just takes it in the temple and kind of unrolls it on the altar, and basically says, God, you see what these guys are saying? Not sure what we're going to do, but maybe you could do something here. And of course, they were defeated. Or I think it's Jehoshaphat, the armies are coming, and he's just like, hey, they go to the temple, they fast, they're like, God, we don't know what to do. This great army is coming. We can't do anything, but our eyes are on you. So we need to think like that because, there's always room for God to show up. And so I think that's very powerful. And even look at places like Egypt, okay? Egypt was conquered by, Muslim armies in like the 600s or 700s. And yet there's still a large Christian minority population in Egypt. The Copts, I think it's something like 10% of the population. So here they've been living for over 1,000 years, as essentially second-class citizens in Egypt. And yet they're still there and their faith is still alive. And they seem to actually be quite successful in a number of ways. There's a Coptic Orthodox church here in Indianapolis, and it's in the most affluent suburb, Carmel. It's a beautiful, gorgeous building. I'm like, man, what's going on? I do a little clicking, and it sounds like the Copts in the United States actually are quite prosperous. They're a very prosperous group of people. So, they're still going, right? And, we're in much, much better place today than the Copts. But even if things got a lot worse, that doesn't mean it's anywhere close to game over for Christianity in America. This side, it's going to be the last pagan generation and Christianity is going to go extinct. That is the sort of black pill thinking that we need to completely reject. And, maybe think much more like the Copts or think much more like some of these Christian communities in the Middle East that lived under often hostile, Muslim rule for, 1,500 years. And yet we're still here. We're still holding to our faith. God hasn't abandoned us. And maybe we need to think like that. Now, I'm not saying that, we're going to end up like them. The Muslims invaded Spain too. And 700, 800 years it took, but they had the Reconquista and Christianity retook Spain. And so this idea that there's some inevitability here, I think is just something we need to totally reject. And of course, I'm not saying that, an American renewal is going to look exactly like the Reconquista in Spain. It's not. It's probably going to be different. It's probably going to be less of a military thing, but more of a spiritual thing. Who knows? And of course, there's no guarantee that it happens. But I think we need to be thinking that way, and we need to be building that way, and we need to be acting that way, and say, we're not going to surrender the United States to being essentially a non-Christian nation where Christianity is just going to sort of boil away and evaporate and die, which essentially means giving up our own children and grandchildren to live either in a place that is deeply hostile to their faith, in which they have to endure a far, far worse, environment than we do, or giving them up. What's worse, giving them over to eternal destruction as they abandon the faith and go along with that. That is not how we ought to be thinking. We ought to be thinking that things are going to get better. We need to be acting. We need to take the measure of the times, but we also need to act in a wise, prudent, and yet courageous and determined manner to start moving forward in a direction that will ultimately lead to a better place for our children and our grandchildren in the church in the United States of America, and hopefully a better, much more flourishing society in the United States as a whole. Now, do I think that's going to happen in the next 5 years? No. I would take a guess that it's not going to happen during my lifetime. And this is where, I think we need to go back to the baby boomers. we need to take a very non-boomer perspective on this and start caring a lot more about what happens after we're gone, instead of thinking about, the solipsism of the boomer and themselves and their whole world in the now. The reality is, it's not about Generation X. It's not going to be about what I've done in my life, most likely. I will probably have done my job if the millennials and Gen Z and beyond, if things are better for them as Christians, right, as people in America, as a result of what we've done than it otherwise would have been, and start giving them the opportunity then to be faithful, right, and to see God show up in their own light generation after generation after generation. And again, think about my podcast, I think it was from last week, about patrimony. We have to remember our patrimony and remember our posterity and do our part without over-functioning for the people who come after us, but without selling them out either. We need to give them the best opportunity to thrive and be faithful that they can be. And so there's so much to, I think, be optimistic about. And that's why I think Thanksgiving is such a great holiday. Let's bring it back to Thanksgiving. I know some of you are not in America, but I'm American, so I'm going to celebrate it. And what we need to do is just think of all the amazing things that we have to be thankful for. There's a lot that we have to be thankful for. And so again, what can you do? One thing you could do, you could keep a journal every year. And that's one thing I started doing, was just, writing little bullet points. Hey, here's something that went right today. Here's something that happened here. So I'll say, oh, boom, boom, boom. I got a parking space in this place where there aren't any parking spaces. That's just a small one. But maybe I don't want to take it for granted that little thing happened. Or it could be something big, such as when my son was born, he had difficulty nursing. We didn't know. We might have to start giving him formula or just give him bottles for forever. But no, he was actually able to start nursing. Blah, blah, blah. Well, things happen. Things matter. So just writing down all the things that you have to be thankful for is a great thing to do. And just regularly giving thanks is important. And Thanksgiving is a great time to think about that and say, wait a minute, I actually do have a lot of things going right. I actually do have a lot of things to be thankful for. There's no reason to fall into despair. Hope is one of the great theological virtues, and our hope is ultimately eternal. And, we orient ourselves on that security, but we can have hope here as well. I think it's in Psalm 25. David said, and again, this is one of these places where they always have some interpolation. So I'm quoting from the New American Standard Bible. I would have despaired unless I believed I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And of course, he ultimately did. So that's important. Do not give up hope now. Do not fall into despair. We don't even have to worry if our entire lives go by and we don't necessarily see the change that we hope to have in the world. Again, right? Think about the guy who plants the seed of the tree under whose shade he will never get to sit. And that's something we need to be thinking about here. We need to be thinking generationally, thinking long term. Think about all the people in places where Christianity seemed to be down and out and yet came back. Or think about all the countries that seemed to be lost and yet they were saved, right? We can think about that too. There's a lot to be thankful for. And let's be faithful. And let's just have a great Thanksgiving with your family, everyone. And I'll talk to you next week.